So, hello everyone. I'm Matt Gilgenbach. I'm the lead developer, or I like to call myself the lead frightener at Infinitap Games. We've created Neverending Nightmares, which was a psychological horror game, and right now we're working on Devastated Dreams, which is on Kickstarter. There's the link for the Kickstarter, and there's a playable demo. So if you like, you can check that out and see if I actually know what I'm talking about. So first I'd like to talk a little bit about the idea of, understanding interactive horror. Maybe it seems kind of silly, right? Like, oh, horror games just scare you. But I think, and certainly, when I just played horror games before I started making them, I think that was a view that I had, is just that, oh, you scare people and that's it. But I think there's a lot of layers to horror that are really interesting, and I hope I can share them with you. So firstly, I think it would be good to talk a little bit about why the advantages of making horror games. So for my background in the AAA, I worked more in sort of the action adventure platformer sort of space. I worked on like some Ratchet and Clank stuff and some Pixar licensed things. And then I went indie in 2008, and I did Retrograde, which is a rhythm game that was very unsuccessful. And then I decided to make Neverending Nightmares as sort of a last-ditch effort. And when I was thinking about what to do following up Retrograde, my first thought was not like, I want to make a horror game. My first thought was, I want to create a game that communicates my feelings with dealing with obsessive compulsive disorder and depression. The problem was that I kept running into is that, I had some ideas for like a top-down shooter sort of thing and try to convey the emotions through the game mechanics. But the problem is that if you're playing like a top-down shooter, you're playing something, usually the expectation is this is going to be fun. And with horror games, I'm sure some people play them and would call them fun, but I think you get a lot of leeway on what is fun and what you can do to create them without basically, you can do some things to sort of alienate the player, and that's acceptable in horror where it wouldn't be in another genre. Another thing that, especially for what I set out to do, is you can explore really dark themes and serious emotions. And you certainly can in other genres, but I think it's sort of expected in a horror game, and so you're tapping into that audience that's looking for that. It's also an advantage is that your game is popular, the genre rather is popular with streamers. And this is good because you have to market your game somehow. You have to let people know about your game, and that was the big problem with Retrograde is people, didn't know about it, and they didn't know what it was. And if you watch a Let's Play of Retrograde, it makes no sense. The only way you can understand Retrograde is if you play it. But I think that's sort of a bad thing for marketing and sort of bit us in the butt, because not everyone's going to give that time, dedicate their time to setting up your game and giving it a try. So I think, the idea of streamers and just the way that the game industry has changed with the advent of Twitch and YouTube and everything, gives us a lot of cool avenues to show off what's great about our game. But, the trick is getting them interested in the game, and so certainly horror games seem to get a lot of views, so those are popular with streamers. And finally, I think as an indie, horror is underserved by AAA. So there's people who love horror games, and every so often there's an Alien Isolation, but usually there's nothing. Like I don't know if any. I don't think any AAA studios are releasing a horror game this year. So I mean, certainly that's a great, opportunity for like Frictional, who's releasing Soma. They did Amnesia and whatnot. So another thing that I think is worth talking about is, why do people like to be scared? And I think this is a difficult thing to answer, because, like, in real life, no one wants to be horrified. No one wants to be, have their life threatened. And I don't know if I can properly answer this question. There's a really good book called The Philosophy of Horror, and it's almost like an academic textbook. It's very, you know, philosophical, very academic, and so they actually define the feeling you get from movies and video games as art horror and not real horror, and then try to explain that. And it's very, very interesting. I certainly can't explain it all. I don't know if I can understand it all, but at least for me personally, I think being scared is interesting on a few levels. One is there's an emotional response, and that in and of itself is sort of rewarding to feel something. But I think another thing, and if you look over the course of my life, I used to be a total scaredy cat, and now, I'm watching like Human Centipede 3 while eating my lunch, which is a terrible movie. Don't go watch it. But basically, like, to me, it was sort of about challenging boundaries, testing myself, finding something I was afraid of, at an earlier point, and coming back to it and being able to handle it. So I think that's sort of a cool thing. Like, you say, oh man, this movie's really scary. I'm gonna try it. I'm gonna see if I can deal with it. So another thing that I think is interesting to talk about is, what is a horror game? And obviously you can just say, oh, it's a game that's scary. But I'm sorry, I should have got a glass of water. But basically, the genre of horror for games is one of the few genres that doesn't describe the gameplay. Like, if I say, an action game, that gives you some idea, third-person shooter, first-person shooter. If I say a platformer, it means you're going to be jumping. But if I say a horror game, there can be a lot of different types of horror games. Certainly, what most people associate with horror is survival horror, and survival horror is sort of actiony, but but sort of adventure-y. There's limited ammo. There's often obscure puzzles. Usually, the combat is difficult to perform well. And I think these are very popular ways of expressing horror in a game, but I don't think it's the only way to make a game mechanically that's a horror game. So there's like adventure horror, like Scratches. The director's cut is on Steam, and it's definitely an adventure game through and through, but it has those horror themes and horror feel. There's like Outlast, which is more of a stealth game. It plays very similar to a stealth game. I think much more than a traditional survival horror. Um, uh, as I mentioned, Frictional Games, the developers of Amnesia, Dark Descent, and Soma, they have a blog, and Thomas Grip, the creative director there, talks a lot about how puzzles are important to games and horror games in general. And so puzzles are good for basically framing objectives and pushing you through a game. And so, like, in looking at my own work, if you look at Neverending Nightmares, it's not survival horror, and we didn't mean it to be survival horror. It's not really adventure game in the truest sense of the word. I think maybe adventure is the genre that's closest to it. but there weren't really many puzzles. There were a couple like enemy based obstacles that were kind of puzzly, but mostly we were trying to create sort of exploration horror, sort of like a 2D gone home horror experience. And that's one of the things is and why I said, the talk is entitled Understanding Interactive Horror, because I don't think horror necessarily has to be a game. And certainly I've had, conversations about whether Neverending Nightmares is a game. And to me, it doesn't matter if you think it's a game or you don't think it's a game. And certainly I can see the argument for it not being a game. But I think, what we wanted to create was an interactive experience, sort of an interactive art piece that you could explore this horrible world and find out more about this, but just sort of be suffocated by this oppressive atmosphere. I think someone in the comments said interactive horror book, and I think that's definitely a fair and astute assessment of the game, especially because we really tried to remove player agency and make the player feel completely powerless or helpless to shape the game. So that was sort of a weird choice for a game, because obviously, games are about the player doing something, the player making a difference, and we tried to remove that. And I don't know, it really worked for what we wanted to accomplish for Neverending Nightmares, but like with Devastated Dreams, I don't think we're really going to do that exact same thing, given that it's sort of alienating for people who are expecting a game, but also it doesn't have that sort of objective framework, that thing pushing you through the game. Especially because there's not like the story components are all cryptic and confusing. So it's not like, the analogy is going through doors is like turning the page, which I think is good. But like, there's not, you don't really feel that drive. Like when I'm reading Game of Thrones, I'm like, holy crap, I got to turn the page. But some programming books, you read and you're like, okay, there's more information. There's more information. It doesn't really drive you, and I think that's something that you can lose if you don't have those sort of story, beats and puzzles or sort of objective tasks. So with Devastated Dreams, we're going to have some puzzles, and again, the puzzles are giving context to the exploration. So I didn't really think of it as a puzzle, but if you played our Kickstarter demo for Neverending Nightmares, we had a very pretty simple setup where early on you see a stairway. If you go down the stairway in the darkness, you're killed. If you go, there's a boarded up thing and you can kind of hear some sound behind the boards. So you go, find the candle. Once you have the candle, you can go down the stairs. Once you have the stairs, you get the axe. With the axe, you can cut open the door. No, that's not really a puzzle. There's no challenge to it. But I think because people saw, we deliberately designed the level this way, but people saw the boards and they knew they couldn't go down the stairs. So, and these were both put like right at the very first hallway, then people had an idea of what they were set to accomplish. Whereas some other levels in Neverending Nightmares, you basically just leave and keep walking and crazy stuff happens. But, and this is a question we get asked with the Devastated Dreams demo, is like, why is the character leaving her nice home? And we don't convey, there's a reason. We didn't have time to, put the reason in the demo because, it's still an early demo. Anyway, lastly, I think there's the action horror genre, which I think like Resident Evil 5 and 6, maybe 4, the Dead Space series, Doom 3. And I think action horror is sort of an interesting place to be. I think a lot of like horror enthusiasts feel like, being able to pick up a rocket launcher and blow up zombies, removes a lot of the tension. But then I think, action games are more accessible. People like that sort of, fighting, and they don't like the sort of frustrating and, you know, doing these weird puzzles and trying to fit everything in their inventory. So I think to some extent, an action horror game, can have a larger audience. But I think it is usually less terrifying, and certainly my favorite horror games are not very action packed. But I mean, again, that's sort of a personal taste thing. And I think, what makes a good horror game is very much a personal taste thing, and it's very hard to pin down. If you look at some popular horror games, we have like Resident Evil. Certainly, the Resident Evil remaster just came out, and it's very challenging. Like, I got the GameCube one, or I got the one on the Wii, and then it was just like too hard for me, and so I ended up like playing it in an emulator with save states, because I played it for a while, and then I got into a point where I'd have to just start over because I used too many healing herbs. And it's like, in the PlayStation 1 days, I think that was, more understandable, since the idea of even just saving a game was new. But, now it feels kind of difficult. But that's something that some people really like in their horror games. They really like that difficulty. They really like that frustration, and that's something that, excuse me, I'm going to talk about more. There's certainly Silent Hill. Silent Hill is my favorite series, horror game series, and it's very psychological. The combat isn't very good, but you can often avoid a lot of enemies. I think it's a little more forgiving than Resident Evil. At least I play on like super easy, and then I can get through the games. Um, but it's interesting also because it's very atmospheric. Like, the town of Silent Hill is just sort of this amazing place to be, where, evil can lurk around every corner, and I almost like the idea of just going home to Silent Hill and being there. They did such an amazing job with the atmosphere. Certainly not in every Silent Hill game, but in a lot of the earlier ones. Amnesia is, again, a very popular one. There are some puzzles, some stealth, some physics stuff, some jump scares, but there's no fighting back, which I think is something special about the game, and sort of a different take on horror. And then finally, there's like Five Nights at Freddy's, which is very popular, and it's a very well done game. But it's mostly focused on jump scares, and I think that's a fair assessment. And it's different people look for different things, and I'll get more into that later. But that there's a lot of different types of horror games, a lot of completely different gameplay. I mean, Five Nights at Freddy's, has more in common from a gameplay perspective with Night Trap than it does, with Resident Evil. And I think that's something really cool about the genre. So I think that, at least for me, the number one thing that makes a good horror game is the mood and the atmosphere. And this is something I think a good experiment would be, try picking out your favorite horror game, Resident Evil, Five Nights at Freddy's, whatever, and then play it on mute and see if you get scared. And I would bet that you don't, that it's just not scary without the audio. And the audio is basically creates that tension, puts you on edge, transports you to the world where danger is around the corner, and also, a jump scare without that beat, that sort of musical stinger is completely empty. It's not startling without the audio, and so I think that the audio really builds the mood and atmosphere. Is definitely something you want to excel at if you're doing a horror game, and certainly I think with Neverending Nightmares and with Devastated Dreams, the audio is the best part. We try to do a really good job with the art and do a really good job with every aspect of it, but to me, audio is the best part, and creates the mood and atmosphere. And another thing, and I don't know, maybe you'll disagree, but like I played all the Silent Hill games, and at least until recently, I played them all except Downpour, and I heard not great things about Downpour, but I'm like, I really want to be uh, back in Silent Hill, so I'm gonna give Downpour a try, and then I just wasn't into it. And the graphics are pretty good. They have Unreal 3. There's some horrible stutters, but I mean, in general, it's a competently made game. But I was trying to rack my brain and figure out why it wasn't really working for me. And I think it's really the audio. And interestingly, it's the first Silent Hill game where Akira Yama. Well, I should have written down his name. Sorry. But it was the first game in which he was not involved, and I think they got the composer from Dexter, but it's very minimalist, especially compared to sort of this oppressive, industrial scores that Akira did, and I mean it really ruined Silent Hill Downpour for me. I mean, a lot of it, there was just like no sound, and then it's just like, okay, there's some fog, but I'm not really in this terrifying place. So I think tension, and this is a quote I like to talk about a lot, from Alfred Hitchcock, who's the master of suspense, and he said, "There's no terror in the bang, only the anticipation of it." And I think that illustrates the importance of tension in horror, in suspense. Without that tension, you can't scare. Then it's just like a startle, right? Like, so sometimes I'm working and I have my headphones on and my wife comes home and goes, boo. And then, oh, you get that sort of visceral, startling feeling, but you're not scared. It's not the same as being scared. And I think the thing that makes it from a startle to a scare is that tension, that feeling of dread, that idea that that darkness and horror lurk around the corner. I think that's really what makes it so scary versus just startling. And so I think Five Nights at Freddy's is a good case study. I imagine everyone's played Five Nights at Freddy's, but there's some really clever details that I don't think a lot of people talk about. But when you're playing Five Nights at Freddy's, the power is always counting down. So I guess, I don't know, it's running the fan, I think. And you think about that from a game design perspective, there's no reason the the fan needs to be on, right? I mean, you could do the math and say, okay, the fan's power drain over, the entire night is this, and just give the player that much energy, give them less energy to account for the fact that the fan's not always running. But I think the idea that the feeling that you see that meter counting down, even if you're just chilling in your supposed safe room, I think that creates a lot of tension. Certainly there's the tension that you see these horrifying monsters and they're right around the corner. But I think the power counting down, no matter what, is really a great detail that really makes you feel that tension, that really amps up the scares. And vulnerability, I think, is really important to horror, and this is something we've tried to really key in on for Neverending Nightmares. potentially to the detriment of some people's enjoyment of the game. But I think, when you're doing, tiger uppercuts and zombies' heads are coming off, right, you're not going to feel vulnerable. You're not going to feel like you should be afraid. You're going to feel like I'm, kicking butt and taking names. I'm Duke Nukem powered, butt kicker, rather than I should be scared. And it's interesting if you look at the Resident Evil games, is as they've gotten more actiony, the enemies you face have gotten larger and larger, and now you're facing these huge, horrific monsters rather than human sized. I don't think I guess they had a big snake in Resident Evil 1, but I mean, otherwise, like was it Nemesis? I forgot what he was called in the first game, the villain. But basically, he was, a large human. And so I think action horror, it's tough to be as scary when you're not vulnerable, and so the giant enemies are sort of one way to compensate, but I think it's not quite the same. So like Neverending Nightmares, we had an asthma mechanic, and certainly some people liked it, some people didn't. But the idea is that, if you can just sprint through everything, then you're like superhuman. I mean, I don't know. Well, I actually have asthma, and so I wanted to key in on that fact. I can't run for very long distances. It's tough. And we actually weave that into the mechanic. So some people are like, oh, just remove the asthma mechanic and then it'll be a better game. And then it's like, well, that ruins the way we've designed all the enemies, because the enemies are faster than you, if you take into account that, fact you have to catch your breath. If you don't have to catch your breath, then, you can just outrun all the enemies and they're not scary. And so that's one of the dynamics we really tried to play is, I think it's a very tense scene when there's a giant baby monster chasing after you and you're running and you start breathing heavier, and you're not sure if you're going to be able to make it to that door, to the safe room, without catching your breath. And I think that vulnerability is what creates the tension, more so than if you can sprint for 35 miles and have a rocket launcher, or, the muscles on top of muscles that the Resident Evil guys have these days. And speaking of our current project, Devastated Dreams, it deals with pregnancy. Our lead character is she's Filipino and lives in rural Philippines. And in the Philippines, there's these legends of aswang, and aswang prey on unborn babies. That's their favorite food. And so the lead character is pregnant, and she's trying to protect her child from these horrible creatures. The side effect of that is she can't be extra physical. She can't run. We made it so she can run a bit better than in Neverending Nightmares. But, I mean, I think, that concession that, she's pregnant, I don't expect her to do, a super high, jump over all these things, gives us a lot of leeway with exploring that vulnerability than if she's just a regular person. Because, if it's just a regular person, you can say, oh, well, I can do this. Why can't this character? And I think a lot of other games, sort of fall into this stereotype with young female protagonists, sort of like Fatal Frame. I know someone mentioned it there. I love Fatal Frame, but I think, that's almost a fallacy. I'm sure there's plenty of young ladies that can totally kick my butt, me with my asthma and everything. So I don't know if that's the best sort of trope of having these young female protagonists who are supposed to be extra vulnerable. But then on the flip side, I mean, it kind of works. And perhaps, it's almost like sort of a fatherly, it serves the fatherly emotions. Maybe that's just me because, I'm expecting my first child, so I think a lot about this. and that's sort of what is inspiring Devastated Dreams. But perhaps, having a young female protagonist, you want to protect her because of some sort of innate fatherly feelings, maybe. I don't know. But then, of course, let's talk about jump scares. And I think jump scares are interesting because there's sort of a trade-off on tension. And one of the most interesting things that I heard about Neverending Nightmares after we developed it was Griffin McElroy on Polygon did a little video overview once we released. And he said that he didn't really enjoy the game because there weren't really jump scares. It was just this constant ratcheting up of the tension, which is how the game was designed. Like, the game, in my mind, was stabbing you with a knife and then turning the knife the entire game. And we worked really hard to get this tension balance and just only increase the tension instead of all this sort of tension and release. Because even if you look at Silent Hill, there's the other world and then there's the regular world, and there's the other world is more tension, but I wanted to try, just pure tension. And it's one of the reasons why I think we had to keep the game, a shorter length, is just to keep that tension. And so we sort of designed it like a movie in terms of pacing. That to me, I thought was the defining, or that was sort of the holy grail of horror game design. I thought if I created that, it would be the horror game. But I think it's interesting, and I think Griffin's opinion is very valid, is that that's not a game that everyone wants to play. It's almost a painful game to play, which certainly a lot of people have said, yeah, like, Neverending Nightmares is a hard game to play, not from a difficulty, challenge, or mechanical standpoint, but just because of the tension, the emotion, and I think that's really interesting. But jump scares are kind of cool because people enjoy them, and they sort of trade the tension for a release. And so you release some of that tension, because obviously you're not going to get one right following it, but so then you can relax and say, oh, okay, well, I got that scared, now I'm safe for a little while. And so, you could create a horror game that doesn't have jump scares. It's just pure tension. And that may be something that people like, but that may be something that is harder to stomach. So I think story is a key component to horror, or at least something that you can basically enhance your mood and atmosphere. So, like, I don't know if you played Spooky's House of Jump Scares, but it's free on Steam. And the basic setup is there's a ghost, her name's Spooky, and she says you have to get up 1,000 floors. And you say, okay, let's get going. And of course there's more lore and more background to that, and the character of Spooky is kind of funny and interesting. But, like, that's a basic setup, and it is a horror game. So, I mean, you don't really need this deep story or background. But, people will ask, why am I doing this? Why am I climbing up these 1,000 floors? And, like in Devastated Dreams, the demo, why am I leaving this house? And, of course, you're leaving the house because you're supposed to be having some contractions and you want to see a midwife, but we don't explain that at all. But if you go and play the Devastated Dreams demo now, know that that's why she's leaving her hut. But I think the challenge, at least the challenge that I've seen, is that it's difficult to tell a story in horror, just because, like, you want to be alone against overwhelming odds. I think that's something that works really well in horror. And even if you look in horror fiction, like H.P. Lovecraft, it's often a character writing about his own experience and, not really about other people. And I think that works really well, is the being alone, having to face these insurmountable challenges, these malevolent forces of evil. And so, in terms of Neverending Nightmares, basically, I originally envisioned all these scenes between the characters and uh, all this cutscenes and all this other stuff. And then I'm like, this doesn't work in the game. Like, we really pared it down to just like these weird, nightmarish interactions and tried to move the story along through that rather than, cutscenes and lots of characters and dialogue. And just because I think it would be detrimental to the atmosphere if we had that. And so with Devastated Dreams, we're taking a different approach and doing a lot of notes and other key items to sort of reveal things about the world and the character. And we're trying to be very careful about how we do that, so we're not, it's not like BioShock where you're finding a recording and then it's someone who basically said, "Oh, here's my master plan," and then it's hidden in some random spot. We're trying to make it fit in the world, and I think it's sort of interesting because we can explain a lot about the world, without having characters that are particularly important. We can just structure like a letter that someone's writing. To hopefully convey something about life in the Philippines and the horrifying world we're trying to create. And certainly, if you played the demo, you can get a feel for how that works and if it works well. Certainly, I think it's something that we're still working on. I think, context, and I've talked about that, it's very helpful to give the reasons why the player's in the situation. And I think that's sort of the minimum level of story necessary is, why is the character in Devastated Dreams leaving the hut? I think if you give that reason, then all of a sudden you're more invested in the game and in what you're trying to do. And I think that's something we didn't have in a lot of Neverending Nightmares levels, just because we wanted that weird sort of aimless nightmarish feeling, but I'm not sure that worked specifically for everyone. So another thing that I think is a good thing to think about is difficulty, and difficulty is something that is often associated with horror games. I talked about my challenges playing Resident Evil. I'm really bad at games, so I'm sure there's plenty of you that can totally own Resident Evil 1. Not me. And so I think that the difficulty creates potentially another layer of tension. And I don't know if you've heard of Chris Pruitt, but he has a website. Chris's what is it called? Sorry, let me look in my head. Chris's Survival Horror Quest. And it's a really great resource, and I'll try and give out the link later. But basically, he had, talks about these experiments of two-factor theory of emotion and how it relates to difficulty, and he has some stuff on his website about it. And then it's also, he wrote an article for Game Developer Magazine for February 2011 that's really good. I'm not sure if that's available. I tried to find it online, but I had some issues with their website, so I don't know if the Game Developer Magazine article is online, but basically talked about someone did an experiment where they had situations where people were in sort of a dangerous situation, and then they got the opportunity to essentially sort of ask the interviewer out. And so those who were in a dangerous situation asked the interviewer out more frequently than those who just met the interview in a normal situation. So I think it was just some bridge over a ravine or something, kind of, I don't know. I imagine it being very rickety and shaky, but I don't know the actual details. And so the premise is that when you're feeling stress or feeling these emotions, it can be confused for other things. And so, like, when you're feeling this, in the experiment, the being scared, you almost confuse it for this sort of sexualized feeling. And I mean, I don't know, it's a theory of emotion. Who knows if it's true? But I think it's interesting to talk about in terms of game design because, it may be true. And certainly, increasing the emotion in one area of the game can heighten the other feelings. And, so potentially tension from the difficult mechanics can make the game scarier. I mean, I'm of the opinion that it's a tough line to walk without making your game frustrating. And then when you get frustrated with a game, at least when I get frustrated with a game, the first thing I do is, sort of curse the game designers. And then when I'm cursing the game designers, I'm remembering I'm playing a game, which hurts immersion. And so immersion is very important to me as a horror game designer to create that mood and atmosphere. So Neverending Nightmares has very little challenge and is basically focused on creating the tension totally through the atmosphere. Because, I felt like the difficulty can limit your audience. And I wanted to create a game that anyone could play. I wanted to create something that it could basically be universal. Because I think, that opens us up to a larger audience and certainly with the themes of trying to educate about mental illness, I think having a bigger audience is helpful. The last thing, I'm running out of time here, but I think I'm near the end of what I wanted to say is the idea of horror without scares, and I think that's a interesting feeling and something that's very possible. And so I don't know if you've seen the movie Audition. It's directed by Takashi Miike, who did a number of interesting movies. But basically, someone pitched the movie to me, and they're like, "This is the stupidest movie I ever saw," and then they sort of spoiled it. And then I'm like, that sounds interesting. That's a movie that I want to see. And then I went and saw it, and I really loved it. So it's definitely not a movie that everyone can appreciate, but it's very slow and very basically just playing with the idea of tension and horror through that tension, and not the scares or the sort of visceral thrills often associated with horror. And so I think that's an interesting thing that we could experiment with, in game design. And I'm not sure. I'm sure there are games like that, but I can't think of any offhand. But I think that's sort of an interesting idea that potentially could bear fruit. So basically, I wanted to pass along some resources if you're interested in horror game design, and I will pass those along. I don't have a login to the chat, but basically, if the moderators could pass those along, I think that would be great. And let's see, I mostly filled up my time, but if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.